Hey, welcome back to We Been New. I'm Cheyenne Doom, and this is Arc 1, Naming the Distortion. And we've been working through the literature that names what was done to African minds, not as history, not as something that happened and ended, but as something that was engineered with precision and is still very much running today. So we finished Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro in episode 4. And if you've been with me through all of this, then you already know. Woodson gave us the external diagnosis. He showed us what the system refused to teach us, refused to show us, and refused to let us become. He named the architecture of the miseducation. Naim Akbar picks that up from the inside, from inside that architecture, actually, with breaking the chains of psychological slavery. Now, this isn't a continuation of that same argument, but this is actually a descent into it, where Woodson showed us what was kept from us. Akbar is asking what was built inside of us and what was built inside of us and put in its place. Not what was withheld, but what was installed. And the reason this book is difficult to read in the best way possible is because you just keep stopping. And it's not because it's confusing, but because you keep recognizing yourself into it. And that was the same thing that happened with me on Miseducation of the Negro. So that's what we're unpacking today. Before I get into the specific psychological inheritances that Akbar maps, I do need to name something that the book makes explicit and that I don't think that we say plainly enough. And so I want to talk about this here. The enslaved African was not just a person who was oppressed. They were legally, formally, categorically property. Not a worker, not an underclass, but they were property, like a chair, like a couch, like a field, like livestock. And Akbar cites this directly. Goodell in 1853 said the slave has no rights. He or she cannot have the rights of a husband, a wife. The slave is a chattel, and chattels do not marry. The slave is not ranked among sentient beings, but among things. And I need you to sit with that for a second. Not ranked amongst sentient beings, but among things. And what I want to connect that to is something that I started thinking about when I was in graduate school. I was studying industrial and organizational psychology. I was developing what would become my treatise, and I was trying to get to the root of something that I just kept seeing and couldn't stop seeing. And the question that I kept circling was this. Today's CEO occupies the same structural position as the historical plantation owner. The business interest was the same: to understand how best to extract labor, knowledge, and resources from Black workers for the benefit of the family at the structure at the top of the for the family at the top of the structure. And today the CEO shares that power with the C-suite and a board and has the same extraction logic that is expanded to cover all workers. But the question I was sitting with was, why aren't the people who hold power in these organizations doing what is necessary to actually extract the best from Black workers? Because if the business interest is extraction, and it is, then underutilizing Black talent is not in the business's interest. So what explains it? Is it cognitive dissonance? Is it a specific dimension of white psychology that rationalizes not only the underutilization of Black talent, but the active blocking of equitable pathways to power? Is it conscious or unconscious? Is it white ideology or white ignorance? And here's where it gets precise. Is there a measurable correlation between the values, beliefs, and behaviors of slaveholders, white overseers, modern white CEOs, and the white decision makers who control the pathways for Black employees to enter and remain in leadership? Now, I didn't have Akbar's language yet when I was formulating these questions, but reading him now, I can see exactly what I was trying to name. The organization didn't stop treating Black people as property. It changed the legal framework and kept the extractive logic. And what Akbar's work helped me to understand is that the psychology of the enslaver, the belief that what is Black is owned, is available, is a resource, that psychology is still operating in people who run these institutions. And the psychology of the enslaved, the adaptations made to survive that reality, is still operating in us. And I kind of knew this a few years ago when I read Post-Traumatic Slaveholder Disorder. But that is the true context for everything that I'm about to walk through with you. Akbar opens his chapter on the psychological legacy of slavery with work, and he opens there deliberately. Slavery was forced labor where the work produced nothing for the person who performed it. A good crop did not improve the enslaved person's life, their family, or their community. It improved the master's. Work was punishment. The need for workers was the most identifiable cause of the Africans' enslavement. And over generations, this is the crucial part, work became equated with enslavement and freedom became equated with the avoidance of work. And he traces everything from our slang, calling a job a slave, or the appeal of get rich quick schemes, to the difficulty of building independent Black institutions, back to the root. And he is careful to say this is not actually the complete picture. Job scarcity and systemic exclusion are equally relevant, but he wants us to know that many of our attitudes toward work have an additional layer underneath it, an unconscious one. And then the next subsection that he gets into is property. And this is where it gets layered, because Akbar, he identifies two simultaneous psychological inheritances that seem like they contradict each other, but actually they come from the same place. There's an unconscious resentment of property because property still belongs to the master. So there's vandalism, neglect of space, and the psychology of inhabiting a place that you don't own and don't feel ownership over. And that has roots. And simultaneously, there is an unnatural attraction to material objects because the cast-off dress from the big house, the Mass's old hat, those became symbols of status and dignity for the people who had been given nothing. And he writes that by wearing Massa's old hat or Mrs. Old dress, one could play at being Massa or Mrs. for a few fanciful moments. And then he connects it to where we are now. Large sums of money thrown yearly on expensive, flashy items. Our most important leaders neutralized by a small trinket of material gain, wearing Massa's discarded hat and thinking that they've arrived. Now, here is where I have to be honest. I saw myself in this. I spent years acquiring the markers, and I thought that that was freedom. I thought that that was power. I had symbols. I did not have freedom. And the acquisition actually made me more vulnerable to real community because I'd been missocialized to see reality as only material and to equate the symbols of success with the actual thing. Now, here is the organizational psychology note that I will add. The textbook that I was studying from in IO psychology, it erased all of this. The origins of organizational behavior were traced to the Industrial Revolution and the military complex. The plantation, the actual first laboratory for American labor extraction, where the science of how to maximize output from a captive workforce was developed and perfected, not mentioned, not even as a footnote. And the DEI chapter that they added, you could tell that it was written with complete contempt. Not a single diverse person to be consulted in crafting the language for that chapter, and the erasure of Woodson's argument. And so Akbar tells us what is left in us. A workforce still carrying slavery era adaptations, but they have simply changed the legal framework, but not the extractive logic. And so now I want to get into two of the most precise analysis in this book, and both are completely legible in the present moment. So the first on leadership. Akbar says, the most certain way to destroy a social body is to remove or replace its natural head. Slaveholders identified indigenous leadership early, and they eliminated, isolated, killed, or ridiculed it. And in its place, they installed leaders who had been carefully picked, trained, and tested to serve the master's welfare. Not the community's welfare, the master's. These were grafted heads on slave bodies. And then, this is the part that lands hardest, okay? The community was conditioned to view natural leaders as troublemakers, as uppity, as people who were going to bring trouble down on everybody. The snitches got promoted, the grafted leaders, they got rewarded, and the community internalized the suspicion of anyone who emerged organically from within it. Martin Luther King was rejected by Black professional classes until enough white liberals co-signed him. Elijah Muhammad never received white acceptance amongst the educated class despite running the most powerful economic self-help program of his era. Farrakhan and the Million Man March, over 1 million people showed up, and the traditional Black political and religious establishment condemned it because white America hadn't approved of that leadership. And the pattern, it really doesn't change. Um, I, we read about this, and I talked about this in Miseducation of the Negro. It's just the sophistication of the execution that does change. So I've cycled through myself through the pet to threat dynamic professionally more than once. And each time I cycled through it, I was at a higher level of visibility and power, which made it louder. The organization could not accommodate what I was becoming. And that is the grafted head refusing a natural one. And I co-owned a salon once where the existing contractors were older white women, and they had a system glitch when 2 Black women became the owners of that space. We weren't even their bosses. They were independent contractors paying rent, and yet there was this silent power struggle with a woman who moved as if she was the actual owner. And that's the psychology Akbar is naming. The body can't accept the head that doesn't come from the master. And so then the second construct that he gets into is the clown. And so back in those days, buffoonery was a survival tactic. A violent, unpredictable slave master could be manipulated and managed through entertainment. You kept yourself safe by keeping him laughing. The problem is that what began as survival has become a structural expectation with structural rewards. And Akbar writes, entertainers and athletes are popular heroes. Physical prowess and comic exploit are the only characteristics Black heroes are permitted to express. Intellectual acuity, prophetic vision, technological know-how seldom, if ever, are portrayed. Consequently, the slave image of power persists. And we watch it play out in real time. The more disrespectful a rapper is to Black women, the more undignified they are by any standard of self-determination, the more they get platformed because they are confirming the master's consciousness. They are being the clowns. And that is the most dangerous form of all of this psychological slavery. The clown doesn't even know that they are a clown. So now I'm going to get into division, family, and feelings of inferiority. And these 3 are very much connected. They were engineered together, and Akbar treats them as a chain. So you may have heard of William Lynch's 1712 address on the banks of James River. And he says, I have outlined a number of differences among the slaves, and I take these differences and I make them bigger. I use fear, trust, and envy for control purposes. Old against young, dark against light, house against field, skilled against unskilled. My plan is guaranteed, and if used intensely for 1 year, the slaves themselves will remain perpetually distrustful. 3 centuries later, fraternities, sororities, neighborhoods, churches, white collar, blue collar, political parties, good hair, good features. These categories have multiplied and the sophistication has improved, but the function is identical. Keep the community's energy consumed in defending the special class rather than addressing the actual condition. And the origin of all of it is still the same outsider who profits from that division. We see it on social media. And then on family, he gets into slavery had no use for fathers, families, and its laws do not recognize their existence. The African man was valued as a stud and a workhorse. The more children he could sire, the greater the master's holdings. The virtues of protection, provision, and fatherhood were actually dangerous on the plantation. And the slave who sought to assert those rights for his offspring was a troublemaker who would be punished or worse, killed. And the African woman was valued as a breeder and a sexual receptacle. Rape committed on a female slave was not even recognized as a crime. And Akbar says the disruption of loyalty and reciprocal protection between Black men and women for almost 20 generations created an alienation that continues to contaminate the respect that men and women must have for each other in order to actually build and maintain healthy families. Now, I have to name something here. Everyone has been expressing shock about the Epstein files and Epstein Island. And the cold and harsh reality is that the entire United States, the Caribbean, and every place enslaved Africans were trafficked to, that was Epstein Island for us. And I specifically exist because my seventh great grandmother, Biabe, who came from Nigeria, was raped by the shipmaster, as was her daughter. And they were passed around Thomas Jefferson's friends and families. And so we are not shocked. We are not the shocked audience for this story. We are the story. And so then I want to get into this next layer, which is personal inferiority. Akbar says that this is the most systematically engineered of all the inheritances. Children separated from mothers specifically because maternal love might cultivate self-respect. The enslaved person forced to bow to the master, to treat him as God, with God rendered visually as a Caucasian man, and every African image associated with dirt and subhumanity. The logical conclusion for the abused, oppressed person is, well, the basis for my condition is my skin color, and the way out is to change it. And I know I was color struck when I was younger, and I recognize that now for what it was. I grew up with mixed sisters, different hair textures, and I felt the weight of not having Eurocentric markers. And that wasn't personal insecurity. That was a very logical response to a system that I was being raised inside. And I say that not, to excuse it, but I grew out of it. And I need to name it and I need to name where it came from. And I did. So I want to get to, well, okay, if we're talking liberation, what does it actually cost? So Akbar doesn't leave us in the wound. He gives us five strategies: knowledge of self, celebration, courage, unity, and faith. And I want to spend the most time on courage because this is where it gets the most honest. He describes the pursuit of mental liberation as being designated crazy. Your credibility, it gets compromised. Your fellow captives, whose minds are still in the plantation, cannot conceive why you are not content with the privileges that you've earned. And the less liberated, less capable people around you get extravagantly rewarded for confirming the master's consciousness. They get the grants, the tenure, the book contracts, the stage time. You go into the desert. Although, actually, I am publishing a book and it will be official next week. But anyway, I know this desert. Making a living as a liberated person when everything was built around making a living as a corporate person, that is the courage Akbar is naming. And I watch right now This administration using its connections with tech companies to identify people who speak truth and disrupt collective psychosis. Assata Shakur was living her best life in Cuba, minding her business, and they renewed a manhunt, calling her the most dangerous enemy of the state, a woman living in exile because the courage she embodied is still threatening to them. And then we get into faith, and Akbar says, without a strong faith in something bigger than your master and yourself, there is no way to engage in the struggle necessary to achieve freedom. Not religion, faith, the fundamental belief that the fight is worth it before the results are visible. Faith is the shield against fear. And he says, one of the great discoveries that comes from learning about who we are as an African people is the overwhelming evidence that faith has been the sustaining force. Where other people point to material or intellectual resources, our power, it has been in our spiritual resources. Dr. Linda James Myers always says, the battle has already been won. And I come back to that often. So, Akbar ends his liberation chapter with 3 words. Well, these weren't the exact ending 3 words, but he says, let's get to work. And then the final move he makes, the first step is acknowledging the slave mentality exists, because the nature of mental slavery is that it creates an illusion of freedom. You do not feel the chains, and that is the design. This podcast is one of my freedom acts. It is unsponsored, unmonetized, one woman reading actual books, learning out loud, sharing what she finds with people who are ready to receive it. No secondhand summaries, no influencer cliff notes. The source is the material, because I know that this is the work that I can do right now. And I know that it connects to something that is so much larger than me. Akbar says, if you sing freedom songs. If you play ball, play freedom ball. Whatever your gift, use it in service of liberation. Don't let it be used to tighten the chains. So, this is my gift, and I will see you next week. And thank you for joining another episode of We Been New.